There is a place on this planet where water gets hot enough to melt lead, where the pressure would crush a submarine like a soda can, and where sunlight has never once touched the ground. And yet, something lives there, something that should not be able to survive even a fraction of that heat, clinging to rock just inches from water hot enough to strip skin from bone in seconds. Scientists who first found it didn't believe what they were looking at. It wasn't hiding from the heat, it was living inside it. Thousands of feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, along cracks in the seafloor called hydrothermal vents, there's a creature so strange that researchers named it after one of history's most famous disasters. It's called the Pompeii worm. And today, we're going to find out exactly how this worm built from soft tissue and DNA can survive conditions that sound more like the inside of a volcano than the bottom of the ocean. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how this worm survives, but why its existence forced scientists to rethink the very limits of life itself. To understand how strange this worm really is, you first need to understand where it lives. Along certain stretches of the ocean floor, particularly around the East Pacific Rise, tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart. Seawater seeps down into cracks in the crust, gets superheated by magma below, and then blasts back out through chimney-like structures called hydrothermal vents. Some of these vents, known as black smokers, release water that can reach temperatures around 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's the part that surprises most people. That water isn't boiling. At the surface, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but down at these depths, the pressure is so extreme, sometimes over 200 times what we feel on land, that it prevents the water from turning into steam even at those insane temperatures. It just stays liquid, scalding hot and invisible in the pitch black. This is not a gentle environment. There's no sunlight, no plants, and normally no reason for anything resembling life to exist there at all. And yet, when researchers sent submersibles down to explore these vents in the late 1970s and early 80s, they didn't find an empty wasteland. They found an entire ecosystem, thriving in total darkness, powered not by the sun, but by chemicals spewing out of the earth itself. Among the strangest residents of this world was a worm, roughly the length of a human hand, living inside thin, papery tubes it built directly onto the scalding rock of the vent chimneys. Scientists named it Alvinella Pompeiana, after the research submarine Alvin that helped discover it, and after Pompeii, the ancient city buried by volcanic heat. The name turned out to be almost too fitting. These vent chimneys aren't static structures either. They're constantly growing, cracking, and collapsing as mineral-rich fluid pours out and hardens on contact with the cold surrounding seawater. A worm building its home directly onto one of these structures isn't just tolerating heat, it's tolerating an environment that is quite literally changing shape around it, sometimes within days. Depending on the vent system, water depth here can range from roughly 7,000 to 12,000 feet, deep enough that no natural light has ever reached it, and deep enough that exploring it at all required purpose-built deep-sea submersibles most people had never heard of before these discoveries made headlines. When researchers first measured the environment around the worm's tube, they found something that didn't make sense. The worm's tail end, tucked deep inside its tube near the vent opening, was sitting in water that measured close to 176 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, just a few inches away, its feathery head was poking out into water that was a relatively mild 72 degrees. Think about that for a second. That's roughly the temperature difference between a cup of scalding coffee and a comfortable spring afternoon existing across the length of a single animal at the exact same moment. No other complex animal on Earth was known to tolerate anything close to that kind of temperature swing. For years, it was described as the most heat-tolerant animal ever discovered, and in some documentaries and articles, that claim still gets repeated as settled fact. But science rarely stays simple for long. As more researchers studied the Pompeii worm in the years that followed, some of them started to question just how extreme those original readings really were. Measuring temperature accurately in a churning, turbulent vent environment is incredibly difficult. Thermometers can drift into warmer or cooler pockets of water within seconds, and the worm itself might not be sitting exactly where the hottest readings were taken. Some later studies suggested the worm's body may never actually reach anywhere near 176 degrees, and that it more likely tolerates conditions somewhere in the range of 85 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Still extreme, but less than the legendary number that made headlines. This isn't a case of the worm being a fraud, it's a case of science doing exactly what it's supposed to do. questioning even its most famous discoveries. What remains undisputed is this: the Pompeii worm experiences one of the steepest and most punishing temperature gradients of any known animal, and it does so by choice, living somewhere almost nothing else on the planet can survive. So how does it actually pull this off? Part of the answer isn't hidden inside the worm at all. It's on the outside. The Pompeii worm's back is covered in a thick, fleece-like layer that looks almost like fur. For a long time, scientists assumed this was just a strange feature of the animal itself. Eventually, they discovered it wasn't the worm's tissue at all. It's bacteria, living bacteria, coating the worm's back in a dense colony, so thick it can be several times deeper than the worm's own skin. This isn't an infection, it's a partnership. The worm appears to feed the bacteria using mucus secreted from special glands on its back, and in return, many researchers believe the bacterial colony acts like a living insulating blanket, potentially helping to shield the worm's body from the harshest heat radiating out of the vent. Some scientists have also proposed that these bacteria may play a role in detoxifying the chemical-rich water surrounding the worm. Since vent fluid is often loaded with compounds that would be toxic to most other life, the exact mechanics of this relationship are still being studied, and researchers haven't fully agreed on how much of the worm's heat tolerance comes from its bacterial coat versus its own internal biology. What is clear is that this worm didn't evolve to survive extreme heat alone. It evolved to survive it in partnership with an entirely different form of life, layered directly onto its skin. But the bacterial fur isn't the only trick this animal has. Inside the worm's own cells, researchers have found something almost as unusual. Its proteins appear to be structured in a way that resists falling apart under heat stress far better than the proteins found in most other animals. In extreme heat, proteins in living things typically start to unfold and lose their shape, a process similar to what happens when you cook an egg white and it turns solid and useless. If that happens inside a living cell, the cell usually dies. The Pompeii worm appears to have evolved specialized versions of stress response proteins, often called heat shock proteins, that help stabilize its cellular machinery even as temperatures spike far beyond what most organisms can handle. This isn't unique to the Pompeii worm alone. Many heat-tolerant organisms rely on similar proteins, but the levels at which this worm can apparently keep functioning are still considered exceptional among complex multicellular animals. Put simply, the worm survives through a layered defense system, a bacterial coat that may buffer it from direct heat, behavior that lets it retreat its more sensitive head into cooler water, and cellular machinery built to keep functioning under thermal stress that would cause failure in almost any other creature. None of these adaptations exist in isolation. They work together, and scientists still aren't entirely sure how the full system fits together or exactly where the worm's true physiological limit lies. Here's where the story becomes bigger than just one strange worm. For most of scientific history, the assumption was simple: life needs sunlight. Every food chain on Earth was believed to trace back, eventually, to plants and photosynthesis. When hydrothermal vent ecosystems were discovered and animals like the Pompeii worm were found thriving in permanent darkness, that assumption collapsed. These ecosystems run on chemosynthesis, where certain bacteria convert chemicals from the vent fluid, like hydrogen sulfide, into energy, forming the base of an entire food web that never needs the sun at all. This discovery didn't just reshape marine biology, it reshaped how scientists think about where life could exist anywhere else on the universe. If life can flourish in scalding, sunless, high-pressure darkness on Earth, similar environments elsewhere, like these subsurface oceans believed to exist beneath the icy crusts of moons, such as Europa or Enceladus, suddenly seem far less impossible as places life could exist too. And the Pompeii worm isn't living alone out there. Around the same vent chimneys, scientists have found blind shrimp swarming by the thousands, giant tube worms without mouths or stomachs that rely entirely on internal bacteria to feed them, and eyeless crabs picking their way across mineral-crusted rock. None of it would exist without that same chemosynthetic base, chemical energy standing in for a sun that never reaches this deep. The Pompeii worm just happens to be the one pushing furthest into the heat, right at the edge where that entire food web begins. A creature the size of your hand, quietly building tubes on the side of an underwater volcano ended up reshaping the search for life beyond our own planet. The Pompeii worm still isn't fully understood. Scientists continue to debate its exact heat limits, the full role of its bacterial coat, and how close to the edge of survival it actually lives day to day. But what's not in question is this. Somewhere along the East Pacific Rise, in total darkness, under crushing pressure, next to water hot enough to be lethal in an instant, this small worm has made a permanent home. It didn't evolve to escape one of the most hostile environments on Earth. It evolved to belong there. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this story. The boundaries we assume life can't cross usually just mean we haven't looked closely enough yet.